good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder, and this is the BRN Sunday podcast. I'm going to be joined today by members of the media, academia, and financial services as we go around the globe to analyze all the news in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, so much more. We've got another great show this week, and our contributors are gearing up for some great conversations. So let's sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of the BRN Sunday podcast. Well, let's kick things off with a look at personal finance. And joining me on the line is Mari Backman. She's a personal finance reporter with The Motley Fool. And I would also wager to say she is a wonderful mom and now great teacher of children. Mari, thanks so much for joining us on the program today.
Thanks for having me, Jeff, and I appreciate the vote of confidence in my parenting skills.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that as I described the start of the remote school year to you, you may want to walk back that statement because some of the stuff we've had to pull in the last week or two just to, balance our own jobs and our kids' schooling, some of the stuff's been a little questionable, basically like putting my 8-year-old in charge of lunch for his 5-year-old sisters because, they switched the time on us at the last minute, and my husband was in a meeting, and I had about 20 minutes to meet a deadline and couldn't stop. So, we've been doing our best.
Well, yeah, and let me just say, I'm not a parent, but I have to, and I'm going to say this again and again because I think that outside of the first responders, the work that parents are doing is unmatched, and they already had tough jobs as parents and educators and showing kids, raising kids right. And my hat's off to you, and we look up to you.
Well, thank you, Jeff.
You're quite welcome. So let's talk about some of the travails, some of the challenges getting school back in session, but it's all virtual for your children.
So it's all virtual for my children, and that's the case in a lot of other places too. As far as everyone I know goes, the only people who are getting school are those who are getting maybe 2 half days a week or maybe even 2 full days a week. But no one in my neck of the woods is getting 5 full days of school. Mm-hmm. So that's obviously, challenging for parents who are trying to do their jobs and also have to supervise their children's education, especially if you have younger children like I do. Mm-hmm. I have twins who are just starting kindergarten. So not only are they young, but they're also really not used to sitting in a classroom for so many hours on a Zoom call especially. So, a lot of parents are really juggling right now. And what I actually found interesting and surprising, I knew that it was going to be a juggling act kicking off this remote year, but what surprised me was just how much stuff we actually had to buy just to make this setup work. And, unfortunately, that's probably a surprise expense that some families weren't planning for, Jeff.
Yeah.
I could tell you that on our end. So, we had our orientations with the teachers, and one of the things that they really emphasized was, please have your children learn somewhere where there's a blank wall behind them. We don't want them distracted by pictures on their wall or toys behind them, and we don't want other children in the classroom looking at your kids' toys and stuff. So my husband and I turned to us and said, oh, well, despite our nicely sized house, we actually don't have a setup where we have a blank wall behind us because basically we turned our basement, which is our play area, into a classroom for our daughters, but there are toys in the background everywhere. So we actually had to go out and buy a green screen, like one of those, actual screens to put behind our daughters while they do their class. And that thing was like, $70, $80 right by
Mm-hmm.
itself. So we were like, okay, sure. Then we realized that some of the, the computers that they gave us through the school district, well, they didn't come, with a mouse, and they're kind of hard to navigate without the mouse, so we had to go and buy a couple of those. And then there was the school supply list, and a lot of it was modified because the kids are not going into school. And normally when you go into school, you've got to buy tissues and other communal stuff for the classroom. So when we got the modified list, I thought to myself, oh, well, it'll probably be a little less extensive because we're not sending things in that are communal for the classroom. But then we realized, well, instead, we're buying a lot of the supplies that you would normally find in a classroom. So, some of us have to buy extra crayons and markers and clay and things, that, we always have crayons and markers in the house, but, clay is something and other, art materials we don't really have. So,
Right.
Thankfully for us, it wasn't too horrendous a financial burden after all is said and done. But, at a time when a lot of parents are already paying for extra childcare, they're paying for babysitters to come into their homes and supervise their kids for this virtual learning, the added expenses have probably caught some people off guard, I'd imagine.
Yeah, look, I think so. I mean, first of all, as we discussed, the mental stresses of doing what you need to do for your children and your family, that's number one. Number two, you already had financial strains, presumably, even if you kept your job, maybe you kept it at a lower income rate than you were used to getting, right? I mean, a lot of Americans may have kept their jobs, but were furloughed or saw some reductions. And then, to go through the virtual experience, as you said, I listened to you talk about green screens and backgrounds. I'm thinking that you're starting your own television network, Mari. And those things are expensive. And I think, to your point, people didn't build that into their budget.
Exactly. Listen, nobody at the beginning of this year could have predicted how this year was going to go. And it'll be interesting too, Jeff, because soon we're going to start coming up on open enrollment, right, where people have to elect their health benefits and, other kinds of benefits. For example, their dependent care, flexible spending accounts. What's your child care situation going to look like in 2021? What are you going to spend on child care? Under normal circumstances, it's somewhat easy to predict, but right now it's like, who knows? Are camps going to be open for children to go to? Are you going to need more child care? Are you going to need less child care because maybe you're going to cut back your hours because you have no choice? So it's just a very tricky time for parents in general.
And I think when I was speaking to another friend of mine who has got a little bit older kids than who you have, and what they were doing is they're in Georgia, and they were having actually learn at homes at different children's homes. So the group of kids were going over this child's home, and they were kind of taking rotations. Are there support groups popping up? I guess my question to you is, in a roundabout way, are there support groups popping up for parents like you and your husband and others to kind of bat around these types of ideas to try to help the school and help your children?
Well, I think, they're popping up because people are creating them. But I'll tell you that in my specific circle, I don't really know too many people who are doing that, just because everyone's got different children and a different work schedule and different needs. So, I have a number of friends who are teachers, and so they don't really have flexibility in their day. They actually don't have flexibility in their day at all. They need to be, either in their homes teaching from home or in their classrooms teaching from a classroom. Even if their students are remote, some teachers are still going into their classroom to do their schooling. So, a teacher has to be on, for example, from whatever, let's say 9 in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon, something like that. That teacher doesn't have flexibility, whereas someone like me, I've got more flexibility because I'm a writer, and even though I cover news items, some of my work is, flexible in nature. I can finish it up at 10 p.m., if I need to. So my needs are a little bit different than someone who's a teacher or someone who has a specific day job. And I also know different people who are self-employed, and they're sort of in a similar boat where, while normally they would do the bulk of their work during the day, now they're sort of shifting that around. So I think when you throw that in and combine it with the fact that, people's kids are different ages, it becomes a little bit more difficult to set up one of these carpool situations for learning, right? It just becomes a little trickier. And then there's also the safety question to think about. Well, if you're going to rotate between homes, well, okay, what's this family doing during the pandemic, and what are we doing? And, do their habits align with, what we feel comfortable with? So personally for us, we haven't buddied up with anyone. and the people that I know, each one's sort of doing his or her own thing. But I think obviously if there is a situation where you can get a group of parents together, look, whether it's working parents or not, if you can get a group of parents together to support one another and to take turns, that certainly takes the burden a little bit off of some people, gives them a little bit of a reprieve. I know it's not easy sitting there and, spending 6 hours of your day, trying to guide your child with this online learning, especially if your child is maybe has some attention span issues or other things. So even if you're not a working parent, if you've got, let's say, a group of 3 parents and, so each of you hosts the kids and supervises the kids once every 3 days, if you can work that out, I mean, sure, great. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Well, kudos again. Hats off to you. You have to roll with the changes, adapt on the fly. You and your husband and other families are doing that. Mari, and you know what? For folks listening to this, I mean, there is a financial element to this that's the reason why we're talking about this. All this has an impact on your mental faculties, your ability to meet your needs financially and income wise. So we really appreciate Mari coming on and talking about her own personal situation and kind of linking it back to finance. Mari, great pleasure talking with you. Best of luck with the virtual schooling. I hear the kids in the background, and we'll talk to you again.
Oh, yeah.
We'll talk to you again in a few weeks.
If I make it till then, Jeff, we'll see if the next 2 weeks of virtual schooling don't do me in. I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. But I can tell you've got a very positive attitude. You're always positive regardless of the circumstance, and that'll carry you a long way. Take care, Mar. Have a great rest of the week.
You too. Bye-bye.
Welcome back. Now time to talk tech. And joining me on the line, he is a senior consumer products and technology reporter for The Motley Fool, Daniel Klein. Hey, Dan. Welcome back to the program.
Hey, good morning, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure chatting with you. We love doing double duty with you during the week because we get to talk about so many great tech issues. And Dan, tech issues are personal finance issues. We always find a way to loop them together. So I know you wanted to talk Apple first. So what's going on with Apple?
So this is the time of year where normally we'd be celebrating the new iPhone. They would put it out. It would look exactly the same as the old iPhone. They would tell you that it has better battery life, that the camera is better. Nobody would believe that. I will buy it. I will get it. And I will think, wow, this isn't any better, but I'm glad I own it. Mm-hmm. That's not what happened this year. They're going to delay the iPhone launch. So instead, they had an event that was built around the new Apple Watch. And the new Apple Watches are kind of interesting. The top-tier Apple Watch has a lot more health-related features. It can take your blood oxygen level. It can tie into all sorts of new apps that they have. And then there's a lower-end Apple Watch that you can essentially buy for your child or maybe a senior relative, where it's tied to your iPhone, but it works. It has its own number. It can text. It can do all the things you would do, with a phone, but it doesn't actually have to be attached to a phone. And it's a way for a parent to sort of monitor where their child is. It's an interesting take on it. They also put out some new iPads, which are relatively underwhelming. And perhaps the most important thing they did is they have a new subscription service, multiple subscription services. One of them based around fitness, and that really ties in with the watch. And it's going to have Peloton-style classes, and the watch is going to be able to take all your data, and give you sort of status reports. And then the second one is built around music and all their other services, like Apple TV Plus. So it's sort of a way to bundle different Apple services and save a little bit of money. It's a big pitch by Apple to double down on service revenue, which is really important to the company.
So Dan, is this the law of diminishing returns in economics kind of showing itself? Because you made the comment, and just putting you on the spot a little bit, you made the comment about sometimes new things can be a little underwhelming. I've always known Apple to be a great company from their inception in 1976 through now. They've had some travails and challenges, but is there just with this new technology, in terms of the average user, people like myself who are not techies or as techies like you, not fanboys. I mean, is this illustrative of that?
Yeah, you probably don't need to update your Apple Watch every year. It's probably something you could go every third or fourth cycle with, and they're aware of that. That said, they've been a dominant player in the watch market.
Yeah.
If Fitbit sold as many watches as Apple did, we'd be celebrating them. They probably wouldn't be part of Google. Instead, because it's Apple, the numbers don't mean anything. These are really successful products, but compared to the iPhone, compared to Apple services revenue, they're kind of like finding a dollar in the couch. So it's a really difficult company to judge. That being said, I do think they're making a leap forward with the Apple Watch, and especially in this age with the pandemic, with sort of our willingness to monitor our own health. I actually think they might be giving people who aren't purely in it for fitness a reason to buy the Apple Watch.
Yeah, look, I think I think there's definitely a clear, as you said, attention to our health. That's great because of the pandemic, but hopefully it doesn't go away. It lingers beyond the pandemic when it's finally over and we're back to some level of normalcy. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I think we're going to be a lot more conscious of our health. Like one of the things we've talked about a lot in the show is work from home. And I don't think we have this massive swing towards work from home that we're pretending we're going to have. But I do think we're going to have a massive swing towards, hey, Jeff, I have a cold today. I'm not going to come in. Where not only are you appreciative of that, you think that's great because you don't want to get sick. So I think something like the Apple Watch, which could tell you, hey, you're not breathing as well as you normally do. Maybe you're not 100% well. I think that might be a trigger which you could send to your boss and be like, hey, I'm going to work from home today, and that's going to be okay. So I do think there's going to be a lot more health monitoring, and I think watches may be a big part of that.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see. Dan, let's talk about PlayStations because every kid is going to be gearing, not every kid, but a majority of children are going to be gearing up to get that new PlayStation that's coming out in time for Christmas, maybe before Christmas. What can you tell us there?
Yeah, so it's more than PlayStation. We are in generation 5 of consoles. So we're going to get the PlayStation 5. We're going to get the new Microsoft Xbox. And here's what's interesting. Sony is coming out with the new PlayStation. The PlayStation 5 is the full-featured, highest graphics. It has an optical drive, which you and I would think of as a CD reader. That means you can put a physical piece of software in it. You don't have to digitally download everything. That's the top tier. It's going to be $499. Microsoft on the other side, their top tier Xbox, same thing, $499. But here's where it gets interesting. A tier down, Sony's going to have its digital-only version. That means you're going to have to download all of your software. That sounds daunting, but the reality is even when you go buy a physical game cartridge, or not cartridge, but CD, there's still like hours and hours of downloading as the games update. So you're not saving that much by having the physical thing in terms of time. That's going to cost $399. Microsoft has the Xbox S, which is the smallest Xbox ever, which I guess matters if you have limited space. Same thing, only digital, but that's going to cost $299, $100 less. What's even more important is Microsoft is offering, let's call it hardware as a service. If you want to subscribe to the high-end Xbox service, which many, many people who use it do, that's one of those scenarios where you get a whole bunch of games, you get a bunch of stuff for free, and then you get access to all the EA games, all the new Microsoft games. If you want to do that, you can buy a subscription starting at $24.99 a month for 2 years where you're going to get the lower end Xbox. If you want the higher end, it costs a little bit more. That to me is a massive advantage over Sony, that you're going to be able to not have to plunk down $299 or $499. You're going to be able to pay a monthly fee, much like you do with your smartphone, to have access to the latest technology. To me, that's a game changer.
Yeah, so it's a I think there's subscription-based services. It gives them that premium, that monthly income, right, in terms of the company, and it's very similar to what you see in other types of businesses, Dan.
Yeah, look, we're moving towards a subscription society. Yeah. And I think that's one of those things where anyone who can get on board, and as consumers, I think we have to worry about getting too many subscriptions. People call it subscription fatigue, but I look at it as like, it's really easy to add new $8.99, $9.99, $24.99. I know anytime I try to buy something on Amazon that's expensive, and I ordered the new Fitbit on Amazon, which I get in a couple of weeks, and they basically said, hey, would you like to split this up into a year's worth of payments, through your Amazon credit card? And it was tempting to do that. On another hand, it really can pile up where all of a sudden you have $300 or $400 a month of these recurring charges, and sometimes it's better to just pay for everything up front.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm just concerned. I don't know. I shouldn't be concerned for other people. I mean, if I was in that position, I had children, I know they want it. I just want to make sure that I can balance my budget every month and not take on more credit card debt. That's the first thing that I always think about. But, call me ultra conservative when it comes to finances. Dan, let me ask you a question. Last question. How's any new Atari 2600 games coming out? Because I still have my 2600 and it cost my brother and I $188 worth of lawn mowings.
I've been pushing for River Raid 2 for 30 years, but it doesn't appear to be happening. Let me just say, as a parent, normally I would be against a subscription, but because we already have Xbox Gold, which is a subscription, we'll probably get the new hardware because it only is going to add a few dollars. And it's one of those things where I'm kind of already paying Microsoft monthly, so why not just pay a little bit more? But I do absolutely monitor sort of what have I cut, what do I have, should I be getting rid of something else? And you also want to look at if you're paying for something on a subscription, and it's something like a phone where you own at the end, do you have the ability to go in and pay it off early? Because I know I had a particularly good month a couple of months ago, and I went into our T-Mobile account and I paid off our phones, which lowered our monthly bill by like $100. Because we were paying for 2 or 3 different phones. So you want to really weigh all of those factors when you look at your budget, and don't let spreading out the payment make you think you can afford something you can't afford.
Yeah, well, very good wisdom, Dan. Always a pleasure chatting with you. And again, looking forward to catching up with you on Tuesday on the network. Talk to you soon. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jeff. Bye.
Welcome back. Now time to talk markets. Joining me on the line, he is the co-founder of Delphi Digital cryptocurrency research firm and also a former equity strategist for Bloomberg, Kevin Kelly. Hey, Kevin, how are you?
Doing well, Jeff. How about yourself?
Doing okay. It's getting cool out there, at least in the Northeast.
Yeah, it's getting cold real quick.
Yeah, I'm not really. I got to say, I'm liking it as opposed to 100-degree weather, but I'm not liking it because I know what's coming, which is really cold weather here in the Northeast.
Yeah, it's happening too quickly.
It is. It's a lot of things happening quickly these days, Kevin. So let's talk about the market because a lot of interesting things happening between today and Monday. Let's break it down for the audience. What's top of mind for you?
Yes, I mean, if you look at equity markets, pretty much flat on the week, which isn't too crazy, just given we're, I think, roughly about 7 or 8% off of the S&P's recent all-time high a couple of weeks ago. And so I think what you're seeing is, one, you had a lot of stories and speculation around some of these kind of long call options trades. That certainly gave a bit of a boost to the market, but I do think that we are still sitting at this very critical inflection point where oftentimes people think about markets as leading indicators, and tend to certainly agree. And I think in order for policymakers and especially in Washington, who have really kind of been sitting in this gridlock for some time now, in order for them to really make a move, I think markets are going to become a bit more volatile in the short term here, which could potentially trigger some faster action from some of the policymakers in terms of additional stimulus, which is something we've been talking about and continue to reiterate. And I'm sure a lot of people out there might even be kind of sick of hearing about this topic area, but I really do think it's one of the most important kind of broader trends going forward, because when you have a market construct that we have today, which is quite frankly, one big macro trade, right? And it very much sits at the center of I should say policy sits very much at the crux of that trade. A lot of financial markets are now, not only increasingly driven by global policy, but also you're seeing elevated intramarket correlations between, some of these major asset classes, which again, can certainly put investors on the wrong side of volatility if we do start to see stocks continue to roll over. The Nasdaq, for example, is sitting at a very interesting technical level, and so if you see further weakness in equities, that could obviously trickle over into a number of other asset classes. And I think the dollar certainly still sits at an interesting level in terms of what it could do on the upside reversal. So there's a lot of things definitely going on. That's a lot to kind of throw out there, but I do think in terms of what we're seeing this week, you had Fed Chair Powell come out after the FOMC meeting, have his press conference. Nothing too crazy, or I would say that wasn't too expected by the market, but I will say some of his commentary was pretty interesting, especially as it relates to lending, what the Fed can do, how much they can really backstop the economy and kind of putting the onus on some of these banks that are at a time in which people need credit are really starting to tighten the lending standards around every single market size, every type of borrower, from industrial loans, consumer loans. And so you continue to have this bifurcation between those who can get funding or who have access to capital and those who don't. And the ones who do are typically your larger kind of companies or multinational corporations that can go to the bond market and issue investment grade credit, for example, which has absolutely exploded this year, versus your average small business who many of which are still struggling to even get their first stimulus check or their first PPP loan. So a lot of things to certainly consider, but I do think that unfortunately we haven't made a whole lot of headway in terms of a brighter economic outlook, at least since the last time we checked in.
Well, you are not allowed to be pessimistic, Kevin. You've got to be optimistic. So let me ask you this. Monday we had a good conversation with J.P. Morgan as global strategist, chief global strategist David Kelly, about the impact of this new Fed rate, inflation policy. How did the market react to that? Here we are. We're talking Friday afternoon. It's about 12:15 p.m. Our markets, from what I've seen, they were up and then they were down. They're a little a little negative today. But just broadly speaking, how were investors reacting?
Yeah, I mean, initially you saw a bit of a whiplash to the upside and to the downside, right? So excuse me. So if you looked at Wednesday, it was relatively flat. You have seen some weakness here over the last couple of days, and I think the S&P will probably end down, a little bit on the week because it started off pretty strong. But going forward, to your point about the Fed's new kind of inflation target policy, I guess you could say, I think they've laid it out pretty clear that they're obviously not going to. And if you look at the updated dot plot, they're not going to be raising rates anytime in the near future, and you see rates saying the zero bound or the lower bound until 2022. And the inflation target is interesting because the Fed has now shifted towards being, I think, letting inflation run a bit hotter than most people would probably expect, above that 2% target level for some time, for some type of moderate period, depending on how they want to define that. And I think it really is kind of a perfect call to action for those who are, bullish precious metals, Bitcoin, crypto, because you literally have, the head of the most powerful and most influential central bank on the planet coming out and basically saying, we will literally do whatever it takes, or whatever within our power and our capabilities to try and spur some type of inflation. You literally have headlines coming out saying that the Fed has failed to deliver inflation, which is a bit counterintuitive if you think about the value of money and all these different things that you really start to kind of study and get into when you dive down the Bitcoin and crypto rabbit hole. The Fed's literally sitting there saying we are going to get inflation one way or another, and so in our view, it just bolsters the case for having at least part of a portfolio sitting in your precious metals, your scarce assets, and digital scarcity with Bitcoin is certainly right in line with that.
So, Kevin, let's shift a little bit and let's talk about crypto, because that's not a panacea either, right? I mean, it's not a utopia. There have been significant ups and downs for Bitcoin in particular, cryptocurrencies, over the last few weeks. How has the crypto market reacted over the last 5 or 6 days since the Fed came out with its new inflation policy?
Yeah, it's been relatively, I'd say the price action's relatively benign. I mean, you've had a little bit of a move alongside other asset classes, immediately after the FOMC, after Powell started talking at the FOMC conference. But again, really hasn't, I mean, it's been relatively flat since then, right, over the last couple of days. Mm-hmm. And so what I think is interesting is, in the long term, I mean, again, I'll say it till I'm blue in the face, the macro backdrop has never been more conducive for an asset like Bitcoin. And I think what's really interesting about it is the short-term trade is anybody's guess, right? I certainly think it could potentially be to the upside. There's some interesting technical levels we're watching right now, that if we see Bitcoin jump above 11,000 and then move towards 12,000, that could be a renewed bull market. But if you're looking at the longer-term investor mentality, it's a really interesting almost inflection point for Bitcoin itself, because if you think about I think we've talked about this before, the typical investor who has access or has the mandate to be able to invest in Bitcoin, it's still limited to, there's still certain parts of the market or certain investor types that are limited to either their exposure or can't have any exposure at all, right? It's not written into their mandates. And so what I think is interesting is as Bitcoin gets bigger and as crypto gets bigger, it will no longer be something that, your traditional institutions can ignore. And at that point, it almost becomes this really positive feedback loop, because as it gets bigger, the market gets more liquid, you have more institutions coming in, because again, if it's one of the best performing asset classes, everyone and their mother is going to be asking their portfolio managers, why they don't have exposure to this, or why they're, running a multi-billion-dollar pension fund, and why they don't have at least some exposure to Bitcoin. And you just see institutions trickling in, and eventually it's kind of like this tide that just lifts, right? It's not a tidal wave of institutional capital that comes in, but it's more like a rising tide. And I just think it's a really unique asset in that sense, because there is no real other asset class out there, at least today from what we're seeing, that has that type of potential positive feedback loop that could trigger in as it gets larger, because all of your other asset classes are much more mature than Bitcoin and crypto. So again, when that happens, anybody's guess, but I certainly think that sitting around just below 11,000 is certainly a great entry point for anybody who's looking out 5, 10, 20 years, because bringing it back to what I was talking about with the Fed and the inflation, and basically putting their stake in the ground and saying we'll do whatever it takes to get inflation and consumer price appreciation, that literally spells or shows you the road to Bitcoin really being one of the best performing asset classes over the next decade or 2 decades, because you have central bankers literally coming out and telling you that they're going to be debasing the value of their fiat currencies right in front of your eyes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, as you describe it, central banks are really heavily invested. Maybe that's not the right word to use, but I'm going to use it anyway. They're invested in the future of crypto, or at least digital currencies. What do you make of, Kevin, our friends at Bloomberg wrote a piece about India plans to introduce a law to ban cryptocurrency trading, which kind of takes it out of lockstep with some of the other Asian economies. I mean, we've talked about regulation both here and on the network. When you think about globally what India is planning to do, what does that mean to you, and in terms of their ideas?
Yeah, it's one of those really interesting kind of game theory ideas, because if you do introduce a new law banning trading in crypto, one, you certainly deter people from obviously coming there and starting up some type of crypto business or being involved in crypto within India, because again, I certainly don't think governments globally can come out and ban crypto entirely, right? Because
Right.
there are ways in which you can trade this in a decentralized fashion. But at the same time, if it's suppressed to a black market, it's certainly going to impact price. I think it's one of those things where this will probably end up getting reversed at some point in the future, because it's almost, if you bring game theory into it, it's almost as if unless every single major country comes out and has some type of ban, you're just going to see liquidity and talent and interest just flow to those other countries that are more conducive for people who are trying to get into crypto. And crypto, we'll say it time and again, but it's no longer this kind of fringe fad developer techie only space and industry. It's really starting to grab the attention of not only high net worth individuals and your kind of more sophisticated retail investors, but global macro funds, institutions. I mean, the fact that you've got people like Paul Tudor Jones literally coming out, and now you've got corporate treasuries with MicroStrategy adding more Bitcoin to their balance sheet. Just this week they announced that it's too mainstream, and it's too mainstream globally, I think, for these types of regulatory statements or plans to really have an adverse effect on the broader crypto market, unless again you see that done in mass by a lot of governments.
Yeah, it kind of blew me away when I saw that, Kevin, and whatever. I mean, people say things, maybe they don't actually go through with them, and you never know what the pushback is going to be. We've seen government here walk things back time after time after time when there's significant pushback. Well, Kevin, I got to tell you, I always enjoy the markets conversation, but I really enjoy the cryptocurrency conversation with you as well. Really interesting space. I'm glad I could Glad we could chat, and wishing you and your family a very nice weekend, and we'll talk to you again next week.
You as well. Looking forward to it, Jeff.
Thanks, bud. Bye-bye. Welcome back, and now we're going to talk real estate. Joining me on the line, Market Watch's real estate reporter, Mr. Jacob Passy. Hey, Jacob. Welcome back to the program.
Glad to be here.
Oh, it's always a pleasure chatting with you. You always bring some really interesting tidbits when it comes to real estate, mortgage rates, and just property in general. So what's top of mind for you and the folks at Market Watch this week?
Yeah, so one thing that's top of mind is the market for new homes and the home construction industry. So had some data come out this week, economic reports and whatnot. So this week, the monthly home builder confidence index came out for the month of September, and it showed that home builders' optimism has reached all-time highs, record highs. So, home builders are really loving what they're seeing right now in terms of demand from prospective buyers and whatnot. But then we also got the monthly data for housing starts and building permits for August. So that data is lagged a month. But in August, the numbers actually dropped slightly, which was interesting given that, everything's been kind of on the up and up for the real estate industry. So part of the drop was driven by, it's a percentage drop, not number drop necessarily.
Right.
It's percentage-wise. So compared to last year, numbers are still pretty high. And in terms of the market, it's not like, I don't want to make it seem like things are going horrible, but compared to July, things were down, which was interesting to see.
Yeah, it seems,
given the optimism.
Yeah, I was going to say you have. One side, home builders are like super excited because you theoretically have new homes that are being built, right? And
right.
We have this pent-up demand and lack of inventory that you've been telling us about for months and months, and even at this point years. And then on the flip side, housing starts are actually down a percentage point since July. So how do you reconcile that? I mean, what are experts telling you in terms of this data?
Yeah, so part of the reason for the drop is just, July was just such an outsized number. It was such a major uptick in terms of housing starts, which is, for folks who are not familiar with the term, that refers to, new construction. So homes that were, permitted or apartment buildings that were permitted and construction began on them. Whereas building permits, when we talk about that, that's like, builders have applied to be able to build on a specific lot and received authorization. So the numbers in July were, astronomically high, really high compared to previous months. It was, a major uptick. And so some of this is probably just a cool off from that and a little bit of an overhang. But one concerning thing that came out of the data, and that will be something that we need to look at, in the months and years ahead, is that the number of homes that were completed, so these were homes that were started earlier this year that were still being worked on and completed, that also fell. And that's concerning because, in a lot of states, there were a number of homes that maybe construction began in February or March, and then, there was a slowdown because of the pandemic. Well, in most states, real estate was one of the industries, home building was an industry, construction was an industry that was allowed to resume work earlier than other industries. And so the fact that completions were down is concerning because it actually reflects that there might be certain factors that will prevent homes from being built quickly, namely labor and lumber. So labor is in short supply. Even though we have, the unemployment situation we have nationwide, not anyone can just build a home. You do need skills to be able to, construct a home. And skilled labor is, for home building is in short supply all across the country. And then when you start adding in factors like what we're seeing in California with the wildfires, what we're seeing in the Gulf Coast, this past week with hurricanes, anytime there's like a major natural disaster, then, in those areas, the labor is going to be divided even further because there are going to be folks building new homes and then folks who could be building new homes but are then tasked with repairing homes that were damaged by those natural disasters. And so there's a very short supply of workers across the country who can build these homes, and that's slowing things down. The other factor is lumber. So, a lot of our lumber supply comes from Canada. There were tariffs on that made it more expensive. And then on top of that, at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of the mills that produce the lumber that's used to build homes, they, laid off workers or furloughed workers and, kept their production low because they were anticipating the pandemic being a major, hurdle for real estate. And that's not what's panned out. But those mills have been slow to come back online. Meanwhile, we've seen this huge, bump in homes being permitted and things like that. So lumber prices are up somewhere upwards of 170% since April.
Wow.
So that, when we talk about that, there's an extent to which home building companies are absorbing the cost themselves because they had a contract with a buyer that was already set in stone.
Yep.
They may not have much wiggle room. But looking ahead, they're going to start building, that high price of lumber into the cost of the home. And so this whole situation is a tough one for home buyers because, like you said, the supply of homes nationwide is really tight. So a lot of folks are just being driven to the market for new homes because they don't have many other options anyway. And now we're seeing, prices jumping because it's more expensive to get lumber. If there aren't that many workers available, you're going to have to pay the workers that are available more. And so building homes is becoming quickly a much more expensive proposition, and that only makes, this whole, gap between supply and demand that much worse.
And driving up expenses. I can only imagine what that's going to mean. I can see why home builders are very excited. Last question, Jacob. We have talked in the past about migration, for lack of a better term, people leaving big cities. Is that still a trend? People are moving out of the New York cities and going to more suburban areas or even rural areas of the United States?
So it is and it isn't. So the trend, I think, a lot of folks talked about that, towards the beginning of the pandemic. Is this the end of New York City? Those types of things. Those are somewhat overblown,
yeah,
I would
definitely.
argue. Now, it's definitely happening to some extent. The question is, are these folks moving? There are certainly people moving from cities to the suburbs, but are these folks people who would never have left the cities otherwise? Or are they, families who just had a newborn who may have been planning originally to move in 2-3 years' time, who are moving now because they're looking at, mortgage rates as low as they are and are sick of being cramped up because of the pandemic. And so now is a good time. So that's, so there isn't a ton of evidence to suggest that there's any sort of, permanent demographic shift going on with people turning away from urban areas towards the suburbs. In terms of moving, though, one other story I was working on this week that was interesting was looking at the situation in California, because prior to the pandemic, we were seeing, a massive amount of out-migration from California because of the high housing costs there, especially cities like, San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles. And a lot of those folks were going to cities like Boise, Phoenix, that were very affordable, but we're quickly seeing home prices skyrocket as a result. But now in California, you have, not only those trends of, high housing costs, high taxes, but you also have the pandemic causing issues. And now you have the wildfires. And the wildfires are kind of an interesting thing to look at because it's not entirely clear, who will, how those will affect California real estate in the longer term and how, where those people should go. Because let's say you're someone who lives in Southern California, you might think you might be sick of wildfires year in, year out. Maybe your property was in close proximity to the El Dorado fire in Southern California that's destroyed a lot of property. So maybe you're, all things considered, you were thinking about maybe moving before, and now the wildfire really has you wanting to move. So you might look to a city like Phoenix. But I've been talking with experts who are talking about, where people in California tend to move is not necessarily where they should move. Because if we're talking about the wildfires, we're looking at this as kind of a climate change issue. And when we're looking at this as an issue related to climate change, well, Phoenix, Arizona is not going to be a particularly comfortable place to live, most likely, in the next 10, 20 years, because, scientists predict that, the summers are going to be hotter and hotter. It's going to be less and less comfortable to live there. So that's like kind of another, element of this is when people are thinking about where they should move, they might want to start, depending on where you live. If you live in a state like California, you might want to start thinking about that in terms of, climate change and, the long-term sustainability of where you're going to move. If you're moving within California, for instance, a lot of folks might be leaving San Francisco. Well, if you're going to some of these suburbs that are near these major forests that are gorgeous, what you're doing in effect is actually taking on more wildfire risk, because you're potentially going to live closer to these areas that have seen fires year in and year out in recent years. And so you might be better off moving to somewhere more urban that's, further away from, the really high risk wildfire zones, or moving to, another state altogether where you might not have the same issues related to climate change that you're seeing in California.
Yeah, I always think I think people might react initially with saying, oh, this is horrible, I want to move out. But when you think about it, and you think about the planning and what it takes to do that, I don't think it's just something that happened. You're not going to see like when people move from the east to the west in the early expansion of the United States. I don't think you're going to see something with that magnitude. Jacob, always a pleasure. You always have such good tidbits, Jacob. Really appreciate the macro to the micro that you're able to deliver each and every week. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Talk soon. Take care.
Take care, bud. Bye-bye. Welcome back, and now trying to shift gears, and we're going to look at what's going on in Capitol Hill. Joining me on the line, David Levine, Kevin Walsh, both are principals with Groom Law Group, an employee law firm, benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, how are you today?
We're doing well, Jeff. It's been a busy year, and it looks like this fall is only going to get busier. We've got a whole lot on our plate with regulations, COVID relief, the election coming up. I'm all guesses what David would want to talk about today.
Yeah, I guarantee that. So, David, what's top of mind for you and the folks at Groom Law this week?
Well, Jeff, I think top of mind is something maybe a little bit different. We've had something coming out every week. For this week, some of the, I'll call it routine, but it's still important, continues going on in Washington, D.C. For instance, I am talking to the Arista Advisory Council later today by the time this broadcast, so I will have talked. And one of the topics they're focused on this year is something that I think is really important in this challenging time, which is diminished capacity. To put it into English, a question that comes up a lot is, how do we know we're paying someone when they're in control of all their mental faculties, and who's responsible for that? Because one of the challenges that we face out there at this point is we've moved to a world where people do everything by computer, or they do it over the phone. And there's a lot of, we've talked about cybersecurity, cyber privacy many, many times on this call about the ways to try to secure people's accounts. So it's not just about fraud, but it's how do you make sure people are protected? The SEC is obviously, with those who are regulated by the SEC, put out a lot. The enforcement initiatives by OCIE at the SEC, kind of their enforcement arm, have repeatedly focused on making sure that the elderly are not taken advantage of and other things. In the retirement space, we almost have an opposite problem at times. Yes, there's the risk of being taken advantage of. I'm never going to say that's not fair. But there's also the issue of how do you make sure that people's money stays where it needs to be and it gets to them in a way that protects them so they can hold it. For instance, if a plan sponsor has outsourced everything to a record keeper, the record keeper, both from a paternalistic, I don't want to make sure to give someone money that gets lost, and from also a liability, I don't want to give someone money and then be told by my client that the plan sponsor or plan fiduciary, I need to pay that money back when it turns out that something was done wrong because someone had diminished capacity. And the Arista Advisory Council is saying, how do we make this work? Because right now, there are a number of challenges. I won't go super weedy, I'll try to be quick. But a very basic one is the standard for determining diminished capacity isn't clear. Because if you are a record keeper and you have a broker dealer or a registered investment advisor, you may look to SEC guidance. Plans have language in different directions on this, and they're all trying to do the right thing. The problem is there's no Arista standard, and we don't want to lock people into something that's hard and messy and too burdensome, because you want people to get their money, but you want to protect them. So what happens is people sometimes get bounced back and forth between the plan and record keeper because it isn't clear who has final say, and they may have different processes. And it's not so easy as to just say, oh, you have to have some standard term, because it's not black and white. What makes it even harder is we live in a world where people live in 50 states and additional territories. And what happens there is that each state can have its own laws. And to be a wonky lawyer, we all say, well, there are Arisa controls or this state law controls, but it doesn't always work perfectly. What this means in the end, and I'll sort of stop here, is that you have a challenge. Because when someone comes along and says, I want my money, how do you make this work efficiently so that they are capable to make sure that they get their money quickly? But how do you protect them at the same time without huge burden and huge delay? My personal view, I think if the Department of Labor over time gave us some safe harbors, not mandating you do it this way, but saying if you take these steps, it's protective and it could be communicated. That way everybody involved could try to do the right thing, which they already are. It would really help people get their money but protect them as they go forward. And I think it's a really great thing that the Advisory Council is looking at this, because this is a topic that may not be top of mind like some of our legislation, but it's very important, especially as America's population ages and we have so many challenges in these current days. Kevin, any thoughts?
Well, David, I just got a listener question over here, and they asked, can you explain what is the Arista Advisory Council?
Oh, sure. Arista Advisory Council is an organization that advises the Employee Benefit Security Administration. It is supported and run by the Department of Labor with outside volunteers, effectively. I probably am butchering the description a little, but trying to keep it simple. And basically, it is a tool and a resource that studies areas after consulting with the Department of Labor. Studies usually 2 topics a year. And I know you asked me the second topic, and I'm not sure what the second one is right now for this year. And it usually studies 2 topics during a year and provides a report to the Department of Labor with suggestions to go to one of our favorite topics. One or two of them. One of them has been uncashed checks. So I know, Kevin, you'll talk about missing participants. and number two, it's talked about things like cybersecurity before. It helps the Department of Labor get an overall picture that brings in outside expertise. It's a very positive activity. The IRS, just as a note, historically has a number of these as well. I was involved in one years ago, but they restructured it over the times as the IRS has changed. So the IRS doesn't have a dedicated one to employee benefits the way it used to.
Let me just jump in real quick and say how refreshing it is that the Arista Advisory Council and others like yourself, David and Kevin, would look at this, because I think that mental health is something that is often underappreciated, especially in the context of what's going on, the stress that so many of us are under with managing families and children. And, to me, it's just really refreshing, and not that it matters, but I applaud this discussion, because, being in control of your faculties and being aware and having your family members aware is really important to maintaining money and safety and security.
Agreed.
Kevin, I know you have some thoughts about what we're going to cover in the weeks ahead, and I wanted to tease that in your own Chuck Woolery voice. So go ahead, Kev.
Well, I think, coming up soon, we're going to do a little bit of an election update. We're going to look a little bit about, what the impact of a Biden presidency could have on retirement security, or take a look at what a second Trump administration could mean for retirement security. As we get closer to the debates, I think, eyes will start turning to the election, and we're going to be right on top of that.
Absolutely.
Hey, and Kevin, we'll be back in 2 and 2.
Gentlemen, you'll be back in 2 and 2. We really appreciate Kevin David, for appearing this morning, this afternoon, depending on when you're listening to this. And I wish you all a great week. David, have fun at the testimony, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Truman. Bye-bye. Well, that wraps up this episode of the BRN Sunday podcast. I want to thank all of our great contributors and, of course, our audience. Don't forget, we're back again tomorrow morning on BRN AM. I'll be joined by Rick Seltzer of Inside Higher Ed. Lots going on in the higher education sector. We're going to be breaking it down for you, the audience. So until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.